Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Hyperlegible. Now that we're on our second episode, this isn't just a one-off thing, it's a real live podcast series. For this episode, we have Utsav Mamoria, who's a writer based in India who recently wrote a piece called How to Live an Intellectually Rich Life. I found it when I was scrolling the Substack Notes app the other day, clicked into it, saw that it had 1,100 likes, so I wasn't the only person who had discovered this post, and for good reason. It was amazing. He weaves everything from Wikipedia and how it leads you to philosophy. If you click enough times, like pretty much everything goes back to philosophy, to the game of life, to this fantasy world that he created to navigate kind of how to live an intellectually rich life and the tools that you need to do so, and then weaves in some of his own personal experience. There was a lot of stuff that I was nodding my head along to. And so I reached out, I DM'd him on Twitter, asked him if he'd be willing to come on the show. Lo and behold, he was, and he was even better than I expected. This is a really fun one. The other thing that makes episode 2 of Hyperlegible legit and makes this a real podcast is that we now have a sponsor. Hyperlegible is sponsored by my friends at Readwise, who build software that helps you get the most out of your reading. I've been using Readwise for years to support my newsletter, my general curiosity, and now this podcast. If I find something that I like in the Substack Notes app, occasionally on Twitter, just browsing the internet, I just click the little Readwise extension and I save it to Readwise and come back to it and highlight it. It's awesome. I think you might be interested in their Reader app. It's like Pocket, but next generation. It has best-in-class highlighting, annotating, AI, and more. It also supports not only web articles, but YouTube with highlightable transcripts, newsletters, PDFs, EPUBs, and even X-Threads. If you want to give it a try, go to readwise.io/hyperlegible. That's readwise.io/hyperlegible, where you start a free trial and get all the articles discussed here on Hyperlegible automatically added to your account. Go check it out, and when you do, you'll find this excellent article, How to Live an Intellectually Rich Life by Utsav Mamoria. Let's get to it. You give the 2-minute overview of how to live an intellectually rich life.
Okay, so the way to live an intellectually rich life is to focus on two things. One is to put ideas above sensations. When I say sensations, I mean bodily sensations of what you can taste, see, smell. So place ideas above that on a pedestal. And the second, try and have more diverse ideas than the ones which you already have. And for doing that, you need to constantly expand the influences you have. So those are the two ways in which you can live an intellectually rich life.
Better than 2 minutes. The second point that you make there, I think, is a really interesting one that I've thought a lot about. There's like kind of this struggle. You know, I write a lot about tech, but then kind of just general stuff as well. And there's this constant struggle that I have where I'm like, should I go deeper in the stuff that I know so I like really know it? Or should I be reading completely random stuff and just like hoping that I find gems in there? How do you balance that?
So I think you should pick maybe a couple of areas in your life which you really want to go deep in. But in one of my other essays, I talk about something in which I say that by actually going deep, you're actually going to go wide, right? So for example, you write about tech, startups, so much of it, right? But so much of it is also influenced by culture. Right? Because, as tech shapes culture and culture shapes tech. So if you go deep in one, you will naturally find yourself gravitating towards other fields, because to understand that particular field in depth, you will have to go to the other fields. You can't just talk about tech and not talk about everything else which is happening around it, right? So I just think of it the same way.
Yeah, I'm smiling because I'm reading Anna Karenina right now. And I was like, just because I want to like read good writing and read the classics, and it's like about time to do that. And I get to the end and I'm kind of like, man, this actually like touches on a bunch of things that I've been writing about recently, which is, specifically kind of like when you get the thing that you want, like let's say that we get flying cars and cancer cures and all that, like how do you find meaning still? And that's like the whole premise of the book. And like, you're not thinking about tech, but to your point, it all kind of lines up.
Yeah.
That's great. You introduced the concept of epistemic anxiety in the piece, which kind of like gave me anxiety because I felt that emotion. What is that? How do you navigate it in your own life, and how should other people navigate it?
So I think the first way, I think I'll define it in a simple way, is to say that when you understand that your knowledge about the world is not sufficient, and not even just the world, whatever field you're working in or have knowledge of is not sufficient, and you know that you have biases, and you worry that you will accept those biases as the truth and start living your life by those, and that gives you anxiety, right? Now, the way to deal with epistemic anxiety, first of all, at least I feel, is to say, accept that you don't know everything about everything, and you don't need to have a point of view on everything. It's impossible for a human being today to have a impossible for a human being to have an informed point of view about everything. You can always have a point of view about everything. So the way to deal with epistemic anxiety is, of course, one, to refrain from being that person who becomes I know it all, and then try and develop an expertise in a few fields while trying to read as broadly as you can. That's the only way you can do it. There is no human being today who can manage the amount of information we are bombarded with today. So
The way that I mean, like you say that, and then there's like 97 different kind of things that you touch on in your essay with a pretty significant deal of depth. I want to talk about the intro to the essay because it hooked me and was kind of like, where are we going with this? The first thing that you talk about is that if you click Wikipedia enough, you get to philosophy like 95% of the time. And then you somehow pulled it into Conway's Game of Life. Tell me how that idea for the introduction came about and what those ideas are. Like, is that something you put in after the fact? Did you find that and start there and say like, okay, cool, now I know where we're going? How do you start to construct an essay from so many different pieces?
So I think all good essays start in the middle, right? You rarely know the opening always coming in, but one thing I was clear is that I want to talk about ideas and how having diverse ideas helps you live a intellectually rich life. But the moment I talk about ideas, I have to talk about philosophy, right? Because so many ideas fundamentally come from philosophy, irrespective of which school of philosophy you subscribe to. Of course, I am exposed to Eastern philosophies a lot more living in India. And as someone who lives in India and works in India, I'm exposed to Buddhist philosophy, Hindu philosophy, and so on. So I had to talk about philosophy, but I didn't want to specifically pick camps because I didn't see the point of that. So I said, okay, what is the broadest way I can talk about philosophy? And of course, this random fact I had read about saying that 95% of Wikipedia articles lead to philosophy just felt like the perfect way to, start. And I'm like, I don't care what school of philosophy you subscribe to. It doesn't matter. All of them will point you to certain directions and they're universal in that sense.
That's cool. And then how about the Game of Life? Because that was
Yeah, so
another
the
curveball.
game of life actually happened completely out of chance because I am an engineering major, and that's when I discovered actually what game of life is, because I think one of our professors was showing a simulation around it or something of that sort, and I was like, oh my god, this is cool. But again, these are the kind of things you don't really remember very well, right? You just forget about it, and then suddenly I was thinking, wait, if I were to talk about emergence and I were to talk about complex systems and systems thinking, game of life is the ideal example because the rules are so simple. And that's what I love about Game of Life, that from a basic starting point to have very simple rules, absolutely bizarre and crazy stuff emerges. So that is where I think I give props to my professors at engineering who really gave me that. But yeah, that's where it really came from.
One of the pieces of tech that I like really, I think would do a lot of good for the world and that I would just selfishly want to try is like a headset that you could put on and like experience someone else's brain. I'd love to go like deeper in your brain and process on this. When you're pulling out that random Wikipedia fact, when you're pulling out the Conway's Game of Life, is that in your brain? Do you have like a big notes file somewhere where you're like, here's a tidbit that I might be able to use at some point? Like, how are you keeping track of all of this? There you
Fine.
go.
Right. So I do write a lot of notes. And sometimes what happens is that I typically would write, the title of what I really want to talk about, and then just start writing whatever comes to my mind. So typically 50% of the stuff which comes to my mind doesn't actually end up making it to the piece because, I can't find connections between them and so on. And I have always believed that, and again, this goes back to discussion on philosophy, and almost all Eastern philosophies, especially South Asian philosophies, talk about interdependence, right? Saying that the world doesn't exist in silos, everything is linked to everything. So if the world doesn't operate and exist like that, why are we trying to put knowledge in silos? That's where I really come from. Because if, and more so than ever today, I think in a globalized world, we are really seeing, one decision having ripple effects across the world. So that's where I was coming from. And one of the other things which I talk about towards the end of the essay is this fake differentiation we have built between the arts and the sciences, right? And I fundamentally believe that they are not very different because as much as there is philosophy of art, there is a philosophy of science and philosophy of mathematics as well, which are all subjects which are studied in all seriousness across universities in the world. So to me, the way I try to pull off all of these things together is to say, the best way to understand something is to understand it in an interdependent way, rather than trying to just say, oh, I'm going to narrowly define this idea. you know I can just, okay, I can talk about epistemology, I can talk about ontology, and I'm like, I don't want to talk about those things, right? Because sure, those are useful headings or categorizations, but I really don't think most of us think of things like that in the real world.
It's just, I mean, I think probably part of the reason that we do is because it's so hard to wrangle and connect all of those disparate things. When did you realize that kind of this was going to be your writing style? When did you realize that you were going to be a good writer? And when did you start writing? Did you realize before you started writing that you were going to be good, or did you get better over time? Like, what was your writing journey?
Yeah, I think I always like to say this, that every overnight success is 10 years. So, I mean, I've been writing since I remember as a child. But I think I started seriously regularly writing when I also run a travel culture and history podcast called Postcards from Nowhere. And it's a narrative podcast. So I just narrate like a story for like 10 minutes or so. And I ran that for about 5 years every week. And I had to write for it every week, right? So the moment you're exercising your writing muscle at that frequency, you naturally get better over time. You're naturally able to tell a better story. And this idea of pulling multiple strands is something which I have always done, even in some of those 10-minute podcasts. So I think it naturally carried over. The difference really came about is that I made it a lot more visual. And I think that is what differentiator is, because this current piece we're talking about takes 30 minutes to read. That's what Substack tells me. Right? I can't expect a human being to read 30 minutes wall of text. I think it's unfair and very difficult in this day and age. So it also brings about some sort of amount of visual relief. And that I learned from a writer named Lawrence Yeo, who writes a newsletter called More to That. He doesn't write on Substack, he writes it independently. And there where he talks about, building worlds, he talks about, and especially building worlds writing nonfiction. Of course, building worlds in fiction is a given, but building worlds in nonfiction is done a lot less. And that's where I got the idea that, okay, I can build worlds, and these worlds can sometimes just be sketches, or sometimes they can be an actual world like I have tried to build in this particular piece. So that's how the entire thing came about. But yeah, it did come to me overnight or in any sense. It just developed over time as a style.
I mean, thank you from one podcaster to another for that incredible segue. So you do build this world in this piece. The piece like kind of morphs from Wikipedia, philosophy, game of life into a fantasy world. Tell me about this world and the different places that we go.
Okay. So the idea is that, okay, you now know how to live an intellectually rich life, but the fact is you have to contend reality. And I never like to write philosophy without contending reality, because I think that there is only when your writing makes sense that people are able to identify with it and probably pick up something from it and take it away into their lives. So I see three challenges for anyone to live an intellectually rich life, and I say this as someone who has a side gig, who has a day job in tech, and I write this and run a podcast together. So I have a fair bit of stuff on my plate. The first one is what I called the forests of Moradoom. And they talk about late-stage capitalism and talk about how much of capitalism has taken over our life, has taken over leisure time, has taken over relationships, and how much we suffer for it in the long run. Because most of us only see a very small portion of the rewards of capitalism, which it is supposed to, distribute in a much fairer manner, I would say. I should say equal, I should say the fairer manner. And what tends to happen is that so many of us start defining ourselves and sort of revolve our identity around our work. And that's why we tend to channelize every ounce of energy and time we have into that. Now, that might be still okay if you are running your own show. But if you are an employee, like most of us people are, right, you should start questioning that. Yes, do a good job of what you're doing. Absolutely no questions about it, right? But don't kill yourself over it, right? Don't sacrifice family time. Don't sacrifice your interests, your passions. What makes you human. Don't sacrifice those things. And the only way to get it around is what I call that if you want to cut through that forest, you need an axe of satisfaction. And the satisfaction comes from, so about 2018, I took a sabbatical from work, and I went to the Himalayas and tried to live very, very simply. That was my experiment of living in a very simple manner, just having, not even having a bed, just a mattress on the floor and, one bulb and a bookshelf, and my meals were catered for. And that's when I started speaking to the caretakers of the cottage, and I understood. And these are people who have lived all their life in extremely harsh conditions. Himalayas can get a very, very challenging place to live, as much as beautiful they are. And I'm talking to someone who's more than 80 years old, right? And she could still walk a mountain faster than I could, correct? But just the amount of satisfaction she had, just the amount of, there's a word we use in India, in Hindi, in the language, it's my mother tongue, is called Thehrao, which essentially, means that you have come to a point in life where you can stay still. You can call it being stoic. Call it being in a place so comfortable that you're unbothered by whatever is happening around you. I kind of got a sense of that, and the word I use is called santushti, or satisfaction. And that's what I really learned from her, that you have to define satisfaction for yourself, because the world will always tell you are dissatisfied. Whatever you have, you should be unhappy with it, and that's a one piece which you have to navigate. But once you sort of navigated that, right, the other problem is that you end up into what I call Igamor, the caves of ignorance, and it comes back to the original point about epistemic anxiety. The fact that there is just so much out there, and it's really, really hard. And every time we are faced with information or data which contradicts our beliefs, our first instinct is to actually turn away from that thing, right? Which is why today our politics is so polarized globally. Which is why we can't seem to agree on things which were not that controversial maybe 50 years ago. Right, and that is where I feel that and I use Plato's allegory to the cave, where he, of course, it's a very, very famous thing. It's hardly new in any sense, and he talks, and that's where he talks about that you have to let go of sensations and focus on ideas, is because ideas is what will liberate you. um, Epistemic anxiety is a question of sensations, because you get anxious, you start feeling that in your head. But the moment you say that, listen, I am beholden to ideas, I'm not beholden to my senses, and that is what really starts to change. And the only way to do it is to be genuinely curious. uh, yeah.
It does feel like there's a bit of a conflict kind of in these two ideas, where if you're talking about life in the Himalayas, I'm picturing like kind of meditation, escaping your ideas, like really living the experience and being satisfied kind of in the moment by just kind of feeling what is there and being present. And then you're talking about kind of going back into your head and like really focusing on ideas versus sensation. Do you see there being a conflict between those two things, or am I misreading that?
No, I don't think there's a conflict, because the moment you are in a place like that, you are forced to slow down. And when you slow down, you actually observe a lot more, because you actually have the time to observe. So, for example, I remember distinctly that after 1 week, there were two trees right in front of me. I noticed their crowns and realized that they'd been struck by lightning. And that got on to be a conversation with them. Okay, how often does this happen? Do these trees fall? Now what happens? Are they dead inside? Will they ever regrow? And that helped me understand that, what is the relationship of people with nature? How does their life change with nature? Now, the fundamental idea is then, which I understood, is that you have to adapt to the conditions you are living with. Instead of trying to fight it every time, the people in the Himalayas accept that, okay, this is how things are going to be, this is how seasons are going to change, and we will adapt and we will accept them and live with that. So the entire idea of slowing down or being meditative is to actually see a bigger sliver of reality than we would experience on a day-to-day basis. And that's what I mean by engaging with ideas. And it doesn't mean that you cannot engage with other ideas outside, but it sort of pushes you to engage with what is here in the moment.
So I interrupted you. You were going through
No
the
worries.
whole map, but that was great.
Yeah.
So continue on our journey.
So the only way you can do that is through the torch of curiosity, because that is the light which helps you. And this reminds me also of a very famous quote. I don't remember who said it, but it comes back to writing. Is to say that when you are writing, you should think of holding a torch in your hand in the dark. You may be only able to see 3 steps ahead, and you may not see how this ends or where this goes. But if you keep taking those 3 steps every time, you will somehow reach the end of whatever you're trying to write. Right. And I think you wrote a note about being stuck about publishing something, and I think that you finally published, or maybe I'm confusing it with someone
Yes.
else. No, it was you, right? And you said that it just feels so good to publish.
Yes.
Put it out, because you can of course edit it endlessly.
Yes.
So coming back, so I think the curiosity bit is super important, because that is something which we can stay true to and not be beholden by our ideas and beliefs and attitudes, which we have sort of picked up over time. But okay, let's suppose, you really push yourself and, you really channel your curiosity, get past those caves. What you're going to get stuck is in Evermore, which is the river of responsibilities. And that is something nobody can escape, right? There is stuff which needs to be done. And no matter how much you dislike it, it needs to be done. And I'm saying this as a person who doesn't have kids, right? For those who have kids, there's a higher level of responsibility coming in.
I
Because
have
it's
two
not,
kids.
you have
Yeah,
two kids, right? So it's not just
it's
about
hard.
being, it's physically present. You have to be mentally present,
Yes.
right? Yeah. So it's not just about, oh, I'm in the same house and the kids are around and that's enough. No, that's not enough. Uh, Similarly, when there is a deadline at work and you just need to sit down and crank it out, there is no question about it. But the important thing to think about it is that, are you seeing patterns in your life where you're actually letting go of good block chunks of time, doom scrolling or indulging in meaningless gossip or, hyperventilating about politics, knowing very well that there is only so much you can change, right? Some of these decisions are way beyond you and me. So that's where I'm saying that you try to look at this patterns. And the only way you can do this is, think of it like, you're in the river, you need to get out of the river. So you need a boat, and the oars are the oars of routine, that you have to fall back on routine. Because the beauty of having a routine is that it reduces the number of decisions you need to take. So if you decide that, okay, well, I practice yoga 4 times a week, right? Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Sunday. I don't have to think. Tomorrow, I will get up and practice. There is no thinking required. Because if I get up and think, oh, what should I be doing this morning? It is a very, very bad way to live, because
Yoga might not win. Yeah.
yeah, yoga is not going to win. Doom scrolling is definitely going to win.
Yep.
Or reading notes on Substack probably now is going to win.
Well, that one's really tricky because I feel like I'm doing something kind of good when I'm doom scrolling Substack, but it's still scrolling and giving my brain to somebody else. So it's better than X maybe, but it's not great.
Yeah. But at least it's not toxic. So I sometimes X can be really, really toxic and just, stress inducing. So I'm kind of almost out of it now. So once you sort of, you cross this river as well through the oars of routine, you actually arrive at the mountains of Luminspire, right? And that's where you really want to go, because I call them Luminspire, the mountains of knowledge. And that is the entire intent, that, you want to live an intellectually rich life. And if you have to engage with ideas, you have to understand that while you may be an expert in a certain sense, in a certain, very narrow field or subfield, there are so many other people out there who are experts in so many other things. But if you're going to sit and if you're going to stand on your peak and just gaze at them and call out to them, they're not going to listen to you. They can't see you. So the first way to, be intellectually rich is to first get down from your peak and say, and I accept that, listen, I don't know anything about this. And the moment you do that, two things happen. One, it opens space for contemplation. You first understand the limits of your own knowledge, even about the specific field you are in, because I don't think there is anybody today who can say that I am an expert in this particular field. I really feel it's not possible anymore. Maybe it was possible 100 years ago. I don't think it's possible today. And then once you, do that and you contemplate, you also sort of let go of your ego. And I think that is the single biggest barrier. There's a quote I have from a Hungarian American psychologist. I forget his name. And he says that all learning requires us to suffer an injury to our self-esteem. And that is why children, and you have kids who will understand, they have no filters. They will go and ask anybody any question that comes to their mind. They will not worry, do they look stupid? Is the question embarrassing? Is it personal? They have no filters. And that is the beauty of being a child, that they are like, they don't have any hang-ups about themselves. They are not obsessed with their self-image. They're not worried about what society thinks of them. They will just go and ask the question. That is where, I also run a cohort-based program called the 6% Club, where we help people launch their content projects, whether it's a podcast, YouTube channel, newsletter. And I've been able to meet so many such experts. I have, a physician scientist from Harvard who joined us in the last cohort. And he wants to talk about metabolism in a podcast. He said there's so much misinformation out there, and he is not only a physician, but he also runs a lab. So he's like the cutting edge of medicine. So I kind of meet a whole bunch of people who then give me the chance to actually ask very, very basic questions, which, I don't want to Google or put on ChatGPT or put on Perplexity an answer. I actually would want to speak to an expert who can give me the context, the nuances, and then give me an answer. right? So similarly, I think what we all need to do is that if we really want to live an intellectually rich life and expose ourselves to more and more ideas, we need to be able to, go and speak to these experts in a meaningful way. And I put down like a 6-step process of how anybody can do it, irrespective of who you are and, where you come from. And that I fundamentally believe is how we could probably live an intellectually rich life.
I mean, you're making me feel good about my decision to start this, because the fun thing about doing a podcast is, as you know, and even about writing kind of generally, is getting to, if you're the voice of the audience and you have to kind of translate, you have to ask the dumb questions to make sure that you understand it well. I could pretend that I actually know everything that you've written about, but I'm asking you just so they know. That's not the case, but it's like, it's a really great opportunity to be able to pick your brain on something like this. So this is a lot of fun to be able to do
Yeah.
this with you.
And I like to call it borrowed expertise, that I will never have the expertise you have. But even if I just take one or two things away from a conversation with an expert, I am so much richer, because those one or two things would be, uh, an amalgamation of years of knowledge and wisdom condensed and then given to me as an insight. And I have the luxury of just borrowing it at face value. And that's the beauty of it.
I mean, like literally, I am taking with this podcast, there's all the stuff that people have done that you've now condensed into a 30-minute read. Now that I get to like pick your brain on after you've just done all of that work to wrangle it, I'm like really trying to distill it as tightly as possible. You mentioned in the piece at one point, I mean, there's like a few different spots where I'm like, damn, that's really good writing. And one is a phrase, you just say sample this. It's like one line, you say sample this. I want to ask you about that. But as you're talking about the community, one thing that I loved that you did is you talk about Erd's number and the mathematician, is it Paul Erd's?
But yeah.
And this guy who's worked with kind of everybody because he was so good at just kind of pretending that he knew nothing and being humble. And then when you call back in the end, when you're talking about the different people in the community and you say, we even have someone with an Erd's number of 2, I just like love those little things where you're like, it must have felt good to be like, oh, I'm going to be able to connect this. In that case, I guess in both of those cases, where did those come from? But in that case, did writing about Erd's come first, or did you have someone who had an Erd's number of 2 and you're like, I need to bring this guy into the essay so I can connect it?
No, it was actually the completely other way around, because I was talking to that person and I was just telling them, she's a professor of computer science. And one of her collaborators collaborated with Ethos. So that's how she has a Ethos number of 2. And I was telling her about it. I was like, wait, do you have an Ethos number? She's like, yeah, I have an Ethos number of 2. I'm like, this is going to be my callback. I had already chosen him for the reasons of, collaboration and letting go of your ego and just speaking to as many experts as possible. So he was, for me, the perfect example of it. So that happened because of that. It was completely a lucky break. Really, it is not something which is super planned or something. The part of sample this actually, two things. One is I'm trained in statistics. So sample is a word which I just use a lot because of survey research and stuff like that. And the second is when I was at university, I used to watch a lot of Monty Python. And they used to say, now for something completely different. Right. And of course, it was never completely, it was exactly the same shit over and over again, the same characters and so on. So I sort of combined those two and say, sample this. Even though I'm not saying anything particularly new, but I just wanted to use that kind of a trope to bring it together.
I mean, it was there's like a lot of dense information in there, and then there's just this one line and it just says sample this, and it just like grabs your attention and makes you think like, all right, whatever's going to come next is going to be really interesting. Like, what does it even mean to sample this? I better like put my brain on so that I can start to sample this. Okay, so kind of going down to the specifics, like I do think there's a question that I had for you, which is like, who is this essay written for? Because, when you're talking about people who are experts in something, is it experts being able to expand their intellectual life? Is it, the novice, just generally curious person? Do you have to have your curiosity developed and let it shine? Like, who do you have in mind when you're writing this piece?
So when I started out writing, because after this piece has traveled and it's got me a fair number of international subscribers who, of course, will understand nothing about the name of the Substack, right? So the name of the Substack is called Tumse Na Ho Paega. What it basically means is that, listen, I can't do this adulting shit. Okay, it's not happening. It's said in a movie in a different context, but I'm using it in the context of I'm a millennial, and like every millennial out there, I'm struggling with some things in life, and honestly, all this writing is just trying me answering those questions, because I'm answering those questions for myself. I'm saying that I'm going to be 40 next year. So how do I want to live the next 20, 30 years of my life? How do I design a life which I find satisfying, which I find meaningful? And for that, I need to answer these questions, right? So it's really built for anyone who is trying, who's either a millennial, first of all, right? Because I feel some millennial challenges are universal. And I think in the US, it's so true that, for Gen X or for boomers, buying a house was so much easier as compared to it is for millennials in the US today, because housing prices have really gone up and wages have not kept up to that level. So it's very hard for a lot of people to buy houses. So many of these things are, common, because I'm also writing in English. I'm started off writing for an Indian audience. It has somehow gone global, but some of the challenges are similar. So I write for a person who's probably, 30 to 50 years of age, going through these things in life. And by the virtue of writing long form, I automatically filter for a curious person.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to persist for a 30-minute piece, no matter how well written it may be and how much art it has and how many concepts it tries to blend. No. So there's a self-filtering mechanism in this, which is why I love all my subscribers, because I'm like, you have stuck with me for 30 minutes and still chosen to subscribe, saying that I will do this insanity next month again.
Well, you give a payoff too, because in the middle of it, you're like, if you've gotten this far, then you're a curious person. And I was like, all right, I feel good about myself. I'm a curious person. I have made it this far. Yeah, that's great. In terms of developing, you mentioned some tips and tricks, like just kind of writing out pieces long form by hand or sketching or doing these different things. What does that do to you? Like, how do you do that in your own kind of practice? And what do you think it does to your brain?
So for me, I don't see language and writing and art as two separate things. For example, if you have ever done any sort of art, even as a child or as an adult, there is a language to that as well, right? There's a language to how you move a brush on paper, how you move a pen on paper, and that language is equivalent to having words, right? For example, all of us have used letters to draw animals as kids, right? If you draw an O, you have a giant tummy of an elephant and all those things, right? The same thing works, either ways. So my point is that for me, sometimes the idea is best expressed in a sketch or in a drawing, and sometimes the drawing just supports the idea. So I remember I had studied structuralism and semiotics in university in my master's, and we talked about that the text anchors the image, or the image anchors the text. So sometimes it goes both ways. Sometimes I might just start writing down something, like for the next piece I am working on, I will be painting sunflowers. Right, because it's going to work with something to do with Van Gogh. It's going to work with mathematics, a whole bunch of other things, turbulence, and a whole bunch of other things are going to get mixed up in that. At the same time, I just finished sketching waves. Watercoloring waves today. In the day, I had some time, so it's not really a linear process at all. So sometimes the sketch will come to me, and I will just get to it. Sometimes the words will come, and then I will say, okay, what sketch will really support these words well. So I wish it was a more structured process, but it's not, and I kind of like that.
There's so many things in writing that you wish could be more structured, and if you try to add any structure to them, the magic kind of disappears. So I get that. To close out, normally this is the second time we've done this, but was planning to do two questions, but want to ask a third. And so I'll start with the new one, which is, what's one other piece of yours that people should read? And I'll link to this in the show notes.
So this is a piece actually which I personally, really liked, but I didn't get as much traction. It's called "Why We Understand Time Wrong," and how understanding it better will help us deal with regret, grief, and guilt. And I think these are emotions which all of us are sitting with for some reason or the other. And I want people to be able to break out of those, cycles, and think of time in different ways, and not let it weigh on you in the way it sometimes weighs on us. So that is one piece I would recommend people to read. The other piece which did well and also had a lot of fun writing is called "Why Are We Missing Awe in Life?" But I feel this one is more important from what we are living through in these times.
You mentioned that the timepiece didn't get as much attention. This one, I think, has 1.1 thousand likes on Substack or something crazy. What does that feel like? How did that happen?
So I really don't know how that happened. So I know that it'll do some numbers basis my distributions, and I have. Typically a piece of mine would do like 4,000, 5,000 reads or something at best, right? Nothing more than that. And those are not new numbers for me because I've been podcasting for 5 years. So I've hit those numbers on podcasting as well. So it's not like something new. So this, I don't know what happened because I expected to do well in, the India, South Asia circuit, where I usually write. And then I woke up the next day and it is just blown up. And I'm seeing names which I'm like, these are not Indian names. These are coming from the West, right? And then I look at some names, I look at what people are reading, I look at some of the pictures, I can see some pictures. I'm like, okay, I can see that these are, Caucasians, people coming in from different parts of the world. And I'm like, oh, wait, this has really traveled. And I was like, I don't know how it has traveled. And of course, I realized that Substack was recommending it basis certain amount of maybe people reading it or velocity of how it was getting shared. I'm sure they would have some mechanisms and algorithms working towards it. And it feels great. I'll tell you why. And this is my advice to anyone who's writing. Mathematics is a subject which is universally despised. Right? People generally dislike it. And trying to write philosophy, mixing it with mathematics is like, why the fuck are you doing that? Why are you pushing people away? I'm like, but no, this is how my mind works. This is how I want to write. And that, so I would like to say your idiosyncrasies are your choice, are your choices are your style. Your idiosyncrasies really build your style. So just do it. I don't think that's what I really want to tell people that, you write what you want to write. Trying to chase niches and, trying to say, oh, this is a trend, I should write onto a trend. And that's where I say that if you're writing long form, try and write in a way that you are writing classic and not writing a piece of content. Because a classic stays longer. Right? The reason you were reading Anna Karenina, which was written, I don't know, 100, 150 years ago, I don't remember when, is because it's a classic. It exists because, right? And when I say classic, I'm not trying to say I'm the greatest writer or anything in the world, but I'm saying write something which has meaning beyond the current moment. It has to go beyond the zeitgeist. And
Yeah, this
that's
piece would do
what I'm
well
saying.
in 10 years. It would have done well 50 years ago. I think a lot of the themes are universal. When you brought up writing about math, you reminded me of another phrase that just made me smile when I read it. And you said, don't worry, it's merely recreational mathematics. And like, there's just like so many of those little moments in the essay that I really loved. The second kind of closing question, is there an essay that people listening to this should read that they probably haven't read yet?
Okay. I wouldn't say one essay, but maybe a Substacker. I don't know how to pronounce his second name. He was actually a jazz musician, and then he pivoted to writing about the music industry. And then, of course, he writes about a whole bunch of other things. And his name is Ted Gioia. I don't know how
Yes.
I don't know how it's pronounced. I think it's called The Honest Broker. And I think he writes a really good Substack. And so much of his stuff is free, so you don't need to pay $5 a month, to be able to read that. I think he's also someone who's been writing for such a long time that his writing is so simple. And that is the hardest thing to do. Writing simply is the hardest thing to do because the amount of clarity you need to have as a writer to communicate it in such simple words that anybody can read it is, I think, a hallmark of good writing. And that's why, for example, I love Hemingway. You don't need a vocabulary beyond a fifth graders to understand anything Hemingway writes. But the ideas are so complex that you really need to sit with some of it and actually get through it. So I would recommend his Substack. I think he's a really good writer.
I wonder what the connection this will be for the next time we do this podcast. The connection between jazz and writing is because Haruki Murakami, kind of cliche, but is one of my favorite writers and kind of similar arc. Like jazz is just like such a key theme in so many of his stories, and he's such a beautiful kind of simple writer. Last question here, and I'm going to take all of the work that you've done that you distilled into 30 minutes. Then distilled into 30 seconds. And now one sentence, if there's like one sentence that you could implant in someone's brain to take away from this essay, what would that be?
I don't think I've explicitly spelled it out in the essay, but it sort of is a recurring theme across my essays, or you can always almost say that it's underlying philosophy, is that consistency trumps everything. It trumps talent, it trumps intelligence, it trumps access, it trumps wealth, because you can build everything with consistency. And that is the only thing I would tell people, that stay at it. Whatever you are choosing to do in life, if you want to do it out of your own violation and choice, please stay with it, because that is how you can write a 30-minute piece. That is how someone like Ted who's been writing for decades, continues to write so well. And that is something which has been proven in every field, right? whether it's sports, whether it is arts, anything you pick up is all about consistency. And the good part is it's in your control. Unlike wealth, which is not in your control, unlike access, which may not be in your control, but being consistent at something is in your control. And I feel that is a superpower which everybody has.
Beautiful. I'm so happy that I came across your writing. I'm so thankful that you did this with me, and hopefully, I'll continue to read. So hopefully we do this again at some point in the future. But thank you for being part of Hyperlegible.
Thank you, Paki. And it's a great idea. I read the post on what hyperlegibility means, because when you sent it to me, I'm like, wait, what does this word mean? And exactly what you said in the piece, I first Googled it. I'm like, wait, this is a new word.
I was so happy.
And I was like, oh, this guy has really coined a new word. Now I have to go and read the post. So I, of course, read it, and now I understand what, hyperlegibility kind of means. I think I'll have to read it once again to understand well. But yeah, it's a great idea. And I think it makes so much sense in the world we are living in today to be hyperlegible, because that is going to be a key differentiator on who, triumphs in the marketplace of ideas, for the lack of a better term.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I hope you have a good rest of your day, and really appreciate you doing this.
Thank you, Paki. Pleasure. Thank you for having me here.